This video has been well overdue. My last Dead Space video before this was in April 2019. The main reason why I haven't covered the third entry of the series yet is because of the game itself. I love the first two games in the series. Dead Space 1 is an almost perfect action horror game, with unique gameplay mechanics, a variety of satisfying weapons to use and enemies to fight, amazing art design, and an interesting universe that was ripe for expanding upon. It's no wonder it got a remake nearly 15 years later, considering how much of a cult classic the game had become. Dead Space 2 then came around and refined the mechanics more, added more weapons and enemies to make the combat even more exciting, it expanded the universe and lore, and it developed the characters more than the first game, even giving a voice to its protagonist. To this day, Dead Space 1 and 2 are considered some of the best games in their genre, and some of the greatest games ever made. It's why, even years after their release, people still talk about them and compare them to modern action horror games. They had set a new standard that very few games since have managed to match or even come close to. But it's when we get to the third game where things get messy. To this day, Dead Space 3 is considered a disappointing final entry in a beloved series, and an example of a franchise falling from grace. This game is the main reason why the franchise went on hiatus for almost 10 years. There's a lot of reasons as to why many people dislike this game. So, strap yourselves in, because I'm going to explain how Dead Space 3 became the downfall of a very, very special series. Development on Dead Space 3 began in 2011, months after the release of Dead Space 2. With that game opening up more of the psychological horror aspects of the series, the team at Visceral and lead creative director Ben Wannut wanted to go even further with the protagonist Isaac suffering from dementia. They thought that this would be a good change of pace after Dead Space 2's more action-focused gameplay, whilst expanding upon elements the second game set up. However, it wasn't long before the team ran into creative problems with their publisher, Electronic Arts. Whilst Dead Space 2 was well received and sold 4 million copies, that wasn't enough for EA, whose games usually ship 5 million plus copies. There's also the fact that Dead Space 2 was not only one of EA's most expensive projects to produce at the time, but also one of the most expensive games ever made, with a development budget of $60 million and a marketing and publishing budget of just as much. Even games such as Mass Effect 3 did not cost as much to produce, despite being a bigger, more established franchise. So, whilst 4 million copies isn't a terrible amount, it's not exactly what you'd be hoping for. This meant that Dead Space 3 was the last chance that Visceral had to prove to EA that Dead Space was a profitable series worth investing in. And because of that, they said that the game would have to ship a minimum of 5 million copies for EA to even consider continuing the franchise. And this is where we run into problems. In order to ship that many units, EA wanted the game to be as accessible to as many audiences as possible. Thus, this meant that a lot of ideas the developers had planned had to be cut due to them not being deemed marketable. For example, whilst the team started out with the idea of making Dead Space 3 a psychological horror game, EA thought that dementia wasn't very marketable subject material for a AAA game, so that concept was dropped almost entirely. The team were also told to include multiplayer in some aspect because at that point in time, EA wouldn't fund a game without some kind of multiplayer component. In fact, EA had been trying to implement such a feature into Dead Space since the beginning. It was originally planned for Dead Space 1, but Visceral Games, EA Redwood Shores at the time, explained that it just wasn't possible with the map design, enemy design, weapons, and so on.
We tried it. It was relatively easy, I believe, to get two people able to play simultaneously. We had two Isaacs in the game.
Okay.
And they were running around. You could shoot. You could, had a lot of hard times getting around each other in the space because they were built to accommodate Isaac, basically, Isaac and +1. So it was very interesting that we revisited it in Dead Space 3, that we were like, we know all these problems exist. We know it's going to be very, very difficult. And it certainly was, but we at least knew what to expect because we had tried it before.
Sure.
Thus, Dead Space 1 released as a completely single-player game. With Dead Space 2, the team were once again told to include online components in some way, but the team just wanted to make a single-player game. So Visceral had a separate team develop a multiplayer component for Dead Space 2, so that it would not interfere with the single-player development. But the multiplayer reception was mixed overall, and the single-player is what everyone cared about and focused on. If you go on YouTube and watch pretty much any review or retrospective of Dead Space 2, none of them talk about the multiplayer. So, with the third entry, EA demanded that the multiplayer be a core feature and be marketed as such. Therefore, Dead Space 3 was developed as both a single-player and a co-op game. Which is odd for a horror franchise to do, but Visceral had some unique and cool ideas for such a feature. The original plan for co-op was that Player 1 would be playing as Isaac Clarke, and Player 2 would be playing as a shadow hallucination of Isaac. But throughout the game, it wouldn't exactly be clear who was the real one and who was the fake one, and both players would have visual and audio hallucinations that the other player would not experience, thus leading to confusion and distrust between the two. This idea did technically make it into the game with the Carver side missions, but Ben Wannart said that this was a husk of what they wanted to do with such a concept.
And at the time we were thinking, okay, well, if we have to do co-op, we should make it from the ground up built into the game. It should be that whether you ever realize it or not until the twist at the end, it's that your buddy all along has been your alter ego. We had considered making him a separate character, so he looked credibly like he could have been this person tagging along with you, but then little by little the dementia would seep in and you would find out that this friend who's been going along with you the whole way is not actually there. We only just scratched the surface on it because, like I said, dementia was sort of given the don't really go into the dementia thing.
Sure.
Which is it's my favorite part of the series, so it's a little hard to stay away from it, but that's how we would have manifested it, and ultimately we would have tried to build it into the climax of the game. The trick is that you have to make it so that it would work for a single-player game as well, play through. But I think that would have been easier to solve than the conveniently not there Carver, that was like, hey, I'm standing in the background of the scene. It's expensive to do, and hey, I'm not in this scene because that's the ultimate cheap thing to do. And it was very difficult to work out, like, when do the two characters interact? How do you make it look like this guy has been with you on the ride the whole way? Whereas I feel like if we just sort of stuck with a Shadow Isaac, you could have easily worked him into every scene and made him an integral part of the story and made him playable. And it would have been wiser. It would have fit the story properly as opposed to, hey, I'm that other guy.
Electronic Arts also placed a much heavier emphasis on making Dead Space 3 a straight-up action game rather than an action horror title like the first two games. If you look at a lot of the marketing, it focuses on gunfights with soldiers, and in the final game itself, there is very little horror elements. So already the game was being tampered with, but it gets worse. Dead Space 3 gets announced at E3 2012, around 7 months before release. And whilst there is the initial hype of another Dead Space game coming out and seeing Isaac and Ellie return, concerns did start to rise about the new direction the game would be taking and its heavy emphasis on co-op. But the biggest concern with the game was the inclusion of microtransactions. Yes, that thing everyone complained about back in 2017 with Battlefront 2. Well, EA was actually one of the first companies to popularize that trend with games such as Mass Effect 3 and Dead Space 3. Dead Space 3 would be featuring options to pay for better weapons and materials. To add on to that, the game would be including dungeons with loot, some of them being co-op exclusive, of course. The game also had pre-order bonus skins and weapons, and it even had Kinect features on Xbox 360 that were completely useless.
Oh, hey, give me ammo.
Give partner ammo.
Sweet.
I love this.
Reload your weapon by saying, reload weapon. You can switch weapon by saying, switch weapon.
Why on earth would I shout reload when I'm already holding the controller and can just press the button? But then we actually get to the game's release, and it's worse than anyone could have imagined. Whilst Dead Space 3 received a lukewarm reception from critics, who called it an okay but disappointing entry in the series, longtime fans hated almost every decision made with the game. And despite a strong opening weekend with sales, the game's sales dropped off hard the next week, leading to the game becoming a commercial flop. Visceral would go on to make a spin-off Battlefield game next, and then be shut down in 2017. And Dead Space wouldn't make a comeback until 2023, with the Dead Space remake developed by EA Motive. So, we already know that the game was doomed to fail no matter how hard the developers tried to make a good game. Before we continue with this video, I just want to clarify something. Whenever I mention Dead Space 1, I'm talking about the original 2008 release, not the 2023 remake. This is because the remake was developed and released after the trilogy, and thus it's not fair to compare story or gameplay aspects when critiquing Dead Space 3. The original Dead Space's combat system was heavily inspired by Resident Evil 4, which took a survival horror series and changed aspects such as the perspective, enemy design, and level design to encourage a more action-focused approach to gameplay. But elements such as exploration, positioning whilst in combat, and inventory management remained so as not to deviate too much from the original gameplay formula of survival horror. Dead Space went even further with the action focus with more aggressive enemies and crazier over-the-top weapons, which was allowed due to its science fiction setting. However, Dead Space's necromorph enemies were unique in the way the player fought them. In most action horror games back then, and even today, most enemies are dealt with just by shooting them until they're dead. With Dead Space, the player would have to dismember enemies to kill them, which not only added more skill of aiming, but also more strategy to the gameplay. For example, cutting off an enemy's legs does slow it down and make it an easier target to kill, but if you do that for every enemy you face, you'll be using twice the ammo. So you have to decide if it's worth going just straight for the kill to save ammo, or making an enemy easy to kill at the expense of resources. When you combine that with a variety of unique enemy types of different behaviors, weapons that all function in different ways and serve unique gameplay purposes, stasis, which allows you to slow down enemies, thus adding more gameplay options and more strategy for which enemies to use it on, as well as kinesis, which allows you to use any physics-based object as a weapon, and you have a unique, satisfying, and challenging combat system that still holds up 15 years after release. Dead Space 2 took the combat system and made it even better by refining all the mechanics and controls, as well as adding new weapons and enemies that strengthened the already superb combat. So the first order of business with Dead Space 3 is, how does it improve upon the combat of the first two games? It doesn't. Every single aspect is done worse. The first problem with the game is the enemies. Dead Space 3 barely adds any new enemies to the game. Most of them are just ripped straight from Dead Space 2 with slightly different character models. The bigger problem, however, is the enemy AI and encounter design. Enemy encounters are now designed to have fully aggressive enemies swarm you constantly. This was probably done to balance for the overpowered weapons that the player can build later in the game, and co-op play. Because of this, however, Dead Space 3 has a very strange difficulty curve, where the early parts of the game are the hardest due to the hyper-aggressive enemies and very weak weapons you'll have, whilst the rest is easy. In Dead Space 1 and 2, the enemies and encounters would start off much less aggressive with fewer enemies, and then would build up as the game progresses, thus giving a nice difficulty curve. Dead Space 3's balancing is completely thrown out the window, making most of the game a monster shooting gallery where encounters just shove as many enemies as possible onto the screen and charge you all at once. It's a very cheap way of creating difficulty, especially in a series with such a variety of enemy types where you can create interesting challenges for the player just by giving different combinations of enemies. It honestly felt as if I was playing the last 3 chapters of Dead Space 2, but stretched out for an entire game. But even worse than the enemies is the weapons. Dead Space 3 heavily promoted the new crafting system, where players can modify parts of their weapons to create unique guns instead of preset guns from the store. You can choose a frame for a light or heavy weapon and then choose a core which determines what the weapon will be. You can also then change the fire type and add special effects to the weapon, such as electric bullets or automatic ammo pickups. The crafting system is a neat idea. Isaac is an engineer after all, so him building his own weapons fits his character, but this system is poorly designed and implemented. In Dead Space 1 and 2, you could have up to 4 weapons at any given time with alternate fire modes for a total of 8 possible attacks. In Dead Space 3, you only have 2 weapons. The trade-off is that the weapons can be fully customized with any combination of primary and secondary attacks, and that in of itself is pretty cool. But in the end, it actually ends up limiting the player's options in combat, since they will only have 2 weapons with 2 fire modes for a total of 4 attacks at any given moment. This crafting system also wrecks the balancing of the game when you can have a double-barreled acid-firing rocket launcher with 0 splash damage or a rapid-fire machine gun that activates stasis on whatever target it hits. It's ridiculous. By the mid to late game, enemies are a joke and easy to deal with. It also does not help that ammo is universal now instead of the first 2 games where weapons had specific ammo types, so you're very unlikely to run out of ammo, and there's 0 resource management with weapons. What this also means is that there is barely any emphasis on the dismemberment mechanic since you have overpowered guns that can kill enemies in seconds. And to top this all off, the progression system is awful. Upgrades are done with materials now instead of credits and power nodes like in the first 2 games. These materials can be found laying around the environment or by using a resource collector to collect resources. You pretty much have to use the resource collector in order to get a decent number of materials, otherwise you'll just barely get by. This was probably done to get people to buy the microtransactions or the DLC that makes the resource collector obtain more resources. Upgrading weapons is also worse now, because instead of the power node system, which always gave consistent upgrades to your weapon, such as damage, ammo capacity, reload speed, and rate of fire, now you have chipset buffs on your gun, which gives you something such as +2 damage, +1 rate of fire, or +3 reload, +2 clip. You can also only put 4 of these chipset buffs on the primary and secondary parts. At first, this may seem interesting as the player might have to sacrifice parts of their gun to give strength to other aspects, such as sacrificing reload time to give a faster rate of fire. However, this is a useless system considering that there's always a limit to how much you can increase an aspect of your gun no matter how many chipset buffs you put on it. Meaning that there is always a best way to arrange the chipset buffs. So they may as well have just used the power node system from the first 2 games. This buff system is just a more complicated way to achieve the same results as fully upgrading a gun with power nodes. But this was likely done to get people to buy microtransactions that give them better buffs. I hate you, EA, so much. These are the 3 biggest problems I have with Dead Space 3's gameplay, and it leads to a combat system that is poorly balanced, has cheap enemy encounter design, is overly complicated for the sake of monetary gain by the publisher, greatly de-emphasizes the unique mechanics of the franchise's combat system, and is objectively worse in every single way than the first 2 games. But not only does this game do everything worse than the first 2 games, it doesn't add anything new to the series. As said, the enemies and controls are all lifted straight from Dead Space 2, and the few new enemies they add are either very similar to already existing enemies or don't have any unique behaviors to make them stand out against the others. There's a useless dodge mechanic now, and it's only somewhat useful against one enemy type in the entire game, but even then you're still likely to be hit by it because the dodging doesn't have any invincibility frames like every single game in existence does. Even Drakengard gives you iframes when you dodge. And that game is a mental stability test. So even if I dodge, I'm still going to take the damage. What's the point? There's these rappelling sections in which you ascend or descend while shooting enemies, and admittedly the descending parts I did quite enjoy, but the climbing sections have terrible and inconsistent hitboxes that can result in the player just randomly taking damage or flat out dying for no reason. The game has also added human enemies that shoot at you in an attempt to appeal to the third-person shooter crowd, but the implementation is awful. Ignoring for a moment that this has no place in a Dead Space game, the cover mechanics barely exist. You can crouch next to cover and shoot over it. There's no vaulting or snapping to cover or switching cover, so the mechanics are very bare bones. Second, the combat in these encounters is just you and the enemy taking pot shots at each other until the other person dies. It adds nothing to the gameplay mechanics of Dead Space. And on a personal level, I hate cover-based whack-a-mole gameplay where I just take pot shots at enemies. It's boring. Third, there's only a handful of these encounters in the entire game, which says to me that they were definitely added just so the game could be promoted as a third-person shooter. It also doesn't make any sense, since in Dead Space 2 there's a section where you encounter human enemies and the game makes a big deal out of the fact that you can't fight them because weapons in this universe will tear you to shreds no matter what type of armor you're wearing. Yet in this game, Isaac starts off just wearing a jacket and he's able to tank gunshots. Are you really going to try and convince me that either the weapons got weaker as the timeline went on, or that his jacket is somehow more powerful than his advanced suit? This also isn't a non-canon gameplay mechanic either. He gets shot in cutscenes and walks it off, so you can't even use that excuse. There are side missions now off the main path, and truth be told, I do like the concept. Dead Space has mostly been a linear series, so giving the player the chance to explore, especially in the early game, and do unique tasks is interesting. But of course, it's poorly done. All of these side missions reuse level design. All of them. It got to the point where I thought I was going crazy. I would be doing a side mission and I would think to myself, wait, didn't I already do this? Only for me to then realize that the levels were being reused, even in areas where it didn't make sense. Why would there be an underground snowy base with skylights in an ancient alien city? The only side missions worth doing are the co-op ones, because they have unique sequences. So pretty much all of the new gameplay additions are poorly implemented and add nothing good to the game. The biggest addition to Dead Space 3 is somewhat of a mixed bag though, that being co-op. Dead Space 3 is playable from start to finish in single player, but you can also play through the entire experience with a partner. The second player will play as the new character John Carver, and he plays the exact same as Isaac but with his unique animations. Playing a game with a friend is always more fun than by yourself, so there is that value, and it is drop-in drop-out co-op, so progress you make is transferred between both the single player and the co-op. The problem is that co-op only makes the game even easier, since it's obvious the enemy AI wasn't programmed to attack two targets at once. So oftentimes it will just stick to attacking one player or attack whoever's doing the most damage. You can combine weapon styles if you want to. One player could use a weapon that stuns enemies or focuses on crowd control, whilst another focuses on precision and range, but considering how much of a breeze the game is, there's really no incentive to do so. Some sections are changed for co-op though. For example, this engine sequence. In single player, you clamp the engine down and then turn the wheel, but in co-op, one player holds the clamp down and the other spins the wheel. The thing is though that if you play single player, the game will still constantly remind you that you should be playing in co-op. 2 buttons to open doors, 2 rappel ropes, 2 activation panels for this hacking minigame. Playing co-op doesn't fix any problems with the game, but it does make it more entertaining since you and a friend can make stupid jokes together to lighten the mood, and you can punch each other in elevators whilst the game loads. so it's still a better way to play the game.
Oh, now you want to have that fucking... That's fine, Lee. What are you doing? What are you doing?
Oh.
We're trying to assemble it. You piece of shit! I'm gonna beat the fuck out of you, man!
Sorry.
Fuck you, man. Fuck you. I hate you. You stand back. Stand back, okay?
I'm killing your elephant then.
Don't you fucking dare. I'm down. Sick, man. You and your fucking dumbass jokes. Oh. First one's dead. Second one's dead.
No.
Oh, oh, fuck. We're gonna do Space 69 or something?
Oh, for fuck.
The game does technically have replay value. After you complete the game, you get 4 extra modes. New Game Plus, which allows you to carry across all your upgrades into a second playthrough. Classic, which disables co-op and only allows you to use weapons from Dead Space 1 and 2. Pure Survival, in which you have to craft every single item using resources instead of just finding them. And Hardcore, which is the same as a normal playthrough, but if you die, you go back to the beginning. This does add more value to the game, as there is things to do after completing the story, but personally I dislike all of these extra modes. New Game Plus? Well, my weapons are already overpowered, so the fact that I'm going to use them from the beginning will just make the game even more boring. Classic? This mode only highlights my issues with the weapon system, since I can only have 2 weapons from the previous games instead of 4. Pure Survival? Needing to craft every single item from health to ammo to stasis is tedious, as you have to scavenge around just to get barely enough resources. Hardcore? I enjoyed Dead Space 2's hardcore mode because it limited you to only 3 saves across all 15 chapters. So if I last saved at chapter 13 and died at the final boss, I only have to go back 2 chapters. In Dead Space 3, if I die at chapter 19, I have to go all the way back to chapter 1. Hardcore mode is so much less tedious in Dead Space 2, and a lot more fun. Dead Space 3 just can't help but step on every rake it finds. I really struggle to find a single thing about Dead Space 3 that it does better than the first 2 games. It is a step down in every single way, or at least every way that matters. But it's not just the gameplay that is a step down, because the story, the characters, and the writing, they're all worse too. In the second game, it's hinted that there is some kind of mastermind group behind the government-made markers, which is what many people believe the third game would focus on. But that plotline is dropped completely. Dead Space 3 takes place 3 years after 2, and during that time, Isaac and Ellie both started and ended a relationship. At the start of the game, Isaac's listening to a message from her saying how she's moving on. The reason why they broke up is explained later in the game, as Isaac wanted to give up searching for the markers, but Ellie kept pushing to find out the truth about them. Both of these don't make any sense. In Dead Space 2, Isaac was the one who kept pushing to destroy the marker no matter what. He was even okay with dying if it meant the marker was destroyed.
What about you? I'm not running anymore. I know what I have to do.
Isaac has never struck me as someone who would just call it quits. And also, why would Ellie care about the markers? She didn't care about them in Dead Space 2, she was just helping Isaac because she had a bigger chance of surviving if she stuck with him and helped him rather than running away by herself. Also, it might just be me, but I never got a hint of romance between the two in the second game. Yes, they do have a bond, but it seemed to me more like the type of bond that you would have with a war buddy, in that you've both been through the grinder, but you've still come out the other end together. It's not unrealistic, but it is a massive jump to go from, hey, these guys are friends, to the next game where, hey, we had a relationship and broke up off-screen. Ellie also then made the excellent decision to start a relationship with another guy named Edward Norton, who is just insufferable. He's egotistical, crass, and doesn't even care about the markers. He just wants to have Ellie as his girlfriend. It's also even stupider when you take into account that Isaac and Ellie went into hiding after the second game to avoid being found by EarthGov, yet she starts dating someone from EarthGov who is a complete jerk and leaves Isaac in the dump. What this leads to is a stupid love triangle dynamic between the three, where Norton will constantly talk to Isaac as if he's beneath him, telling him how much of a bigger male member he has, and even trying to get him killed.
Isaac, Norton here.
Are you contacting me on a private channel?
Because I need to know if you're on my side.
We're taking sides now?
I know you two had a thing, but she's mine now, and I love her too much to let her do this.
If she's right and this is the marker homeworld, maybe there's a chance of stopping this.
Look, we both know how this is going to end. If they found a way to stop the markers 200 years ago, don't you think we'd all be safe by now? It doesn't add up. Oh, I get it. I get it. You think you and her... Yeah, we'll forget it. She's over it, all right?
At one point, he even tries to give up Isaac to unitologists, and then turns around and blames Isaac for nearly getting them killed. Luckily, you do get to shoot him, but that leads to Isaac and Ellie bickering for an entire chapter about him killing Norton.
Ellie, come on. Norton was pointing a gun at my face. I'm sorry.
Is that supposed to make it okay? You never believed in me, or this mission, or us. I had to go find someone else to help me, and now he's dead. You sabotaged it, just like everything else.
What's that supposed to mean? Is that what you really think?
Yes, they brought you here at gunpoint. I guess that's what it took.
I'm not here because someone put a gun to my head.
Yeah, well, Norton's dead because someone put one to his.
Before then being immediately resolved in the next chapter. What does this love triangle add to the story or characters? Absolutely nothing. Isaac and Ellie don't progress as characters because of it. It leads to forced and nonsensical drama just for the sake of having character drama, not because it has any actual story purpose, and it's irritating to listen to, especially when I played this game 4 times for this video and I can't skip the cutscenes, so I had to listen to this dialogue 4 separate times. It's not an issue of the actors. I love Gunnar and Sunita especially, but the material they're given is just horrible.
Isaac, you made it.
Thank God.
I knew you'd catch up.
Good to see you made it, Isaac. Yeah, maybe we should give you two some time alone, huh?
What the hell does that mean?
It means for someone who's in the past, you're awfully glad to see him.
We need him. This mission needs him.
We need him or you need him?
You got something to say to me, Captain?
Shut your fucking mouth!
Speaking more of Ellie though, her character in this game is awful. She does nothing the whole game. Nothing. All she does the entire game is constantly say, "We need to find the machine," whilst other characters who serve no purpose aside from exposition tell us information on the machine. It's no wonder I didn't care when they died. This is a far cry from her character in the second game, who fought necromorphs by herself and nearly got herself killed trying to save Isaac many, many times. So to have her contribute absolutely nothing to the game is disappointing. Part of me thinks that Ellie should have been the co-op partner. It would have developed her relationship with Isaac more. Instead, we get John Carver, and I like Carver. Carver lost his wife and his son because of unitologists and feels nothing but guilt over the way he treated them. He frequently suffers from visual and audio hallucinations, manifesting his worst nightmares, and he even says towards the end of the game that he hopes everything he's done in getting Isaac this far has made up for all of his mistakes. This is a really great scene, by the way.
I helped get us this far. And that's close enough for all this to count, right?
Count for what?
I don't know, just all the bad I've done.
Oh, shut up, Carver. You're a good man.
I alienated my son, wrecked my family. Isaac, I killed Santos. Is that what a good man does?
Good men mean well. You just don't always end up doing well.
The co-op missions with him flesh out his character and backstory a lot, and you get some of the co-op hallucinations where one player sees something the other doesn't, and it did freak us out a bit when playing.
On top of the barrel.
No. It's not a barrel. There's no barrel here.
There's just a barrel for me.
Well, it's a giant fucking toy soldier.
Plus, the friendship between him and Isaac is really well done. At the start, you can tell Carver feels like he's babysitting Isaac and telling him not to get too comfortable.
Who's that?
Boy.
Cute kid. You leave him behind?
He's dead. Danik killed him. And his mother.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Don't be. We're not friends.
Well, thanks for the rescue back there.
Try harder next time.
But as the game goes on, and through their combined struggle, they grow on each other, eventually cracking jokes with one another.
Jesus, I really thought that was it.
Yeah. Fuck this planet. Let's get out of here.
It's really engaging to see, and Carver is definitely a welcome addition to the series. He's clearly someone who has lost his sanity, but is trying to keep everyone else sane and focused on the mission.
Isaac! I love you!
Isaac! Hey! That gas is still coming! We gotta go! Now! She's all I got. This was her mission. She knew better than anyone how important it was. Now we've got to finish this for her! Got it? Do you got it? Yeah. Then let's go! Isaac, now! Isaac!
Ricardo Chivera, I love you. But there's a problem. If you just play the single player, you don't get any of that. Carver is only with Isaac in a few scenes, and they always make up some excuse as to why he's not with you.
It looks like Danik unlocked access to all floors.
Where'd he go?
I don't... Where'd he go? I don't know! Jesus!
Son of a bitch. Okay, all right. We're gonna split up. You take floor 1, I'll take floor 2.
Sometimes it's really stupid, such as this boss fight where you can hear Carver's dialogue, but he's nowhere to be found.
Are you shooting me? Yeah! I think we're just pissing it off! Oh, it's working!
And so, because you never see Carver's inner conflict, and because he spends no time with Isaac, this great scene between the two just comes out of nowhere. It's a payoff with no build-up. The worst part is that some cutscenes were made with single player in mind, and others were made with co-op in mind. So, no matter which way you play, there'll be some oddities in the cutscenes. So overall, the characters of Dead Space 3 are lackluster, and so is the writing with them. There are some good moments, but most scenes with characters are either exposition dumps, forced drama, or insufferable dialogue. But what about the plot? Well, Dead Space 3 finally gives the answers on what the markers truly are. Centuries ago, an alien race encountered the markers on a planet named Tau Volantis. The ultimate goal of a marker is to achieve convergence, which happens when a marker has accumulated enough necromorph flesh to create a blood moon, which is a gigantic moon-sized necromorph that emits the marker signal across space, with the single shared goal of consuming all life in the galaxy. The aliens couldn't stop convergence, but they could put it on hold by freezing the planet using a machine. The markers do initially try to trick Isaac into turning the machine off so that convergence can continue, but he eventually learns that the machine can be reprogrammed to stop convergence altogether. I'm actually pretty satisfied with these answers, which is really hard to do with Eldritch Horror, because the idea with Eldritch Horror is that these beings are so beyond human comprehension that it's scary to even think about them existing. However, I think this makes the markers even more terrifying as a concept. These inanimate objects that manipulate anyone who comes into contact with them to do their bidding, using the darkest and most sensitive parts of their minds to make them believe that this is the next step in human evolution, only to create monsters so powerful that the greatest feat ever made against them was delaying their plans, not flat out stopping them. But I also understand the perspective of many players who prefers the mystery of the markers and would have preferred it if the games never gave a clear answer. Fear of the unknown, as they say. So, lore-wise, Dead Space 3 is actually pretty good. It's just as fleshed out as the previous two games, with a lot of background information the player can indulge themselves in. But it's how these elements are used in the plot that is ridiculous. So they find marker text that talks about turning off a machine. This woman Santos then finds more research on said machine and how to find it. She dies, and the group finds a lab with an alien that gives Isaac a hallucination of the past, which is when he decides to focus on reprogramming the machine. Ellie then dies, but she doesn't. The game does this fake out, but then she's revealed to be alive an hour later, and to have been captured by the villain Danik. He's a very boring villain who just spouts unitologist propaganda. His death is pretty funny though. So Danik uses Ellie as a hostage in order to get Isaac to give over the codex, since Danik can use it to turn off the machine. Isaac refuses because he knows the consequences, but Carver decides to have a character development moment and throws the codex to Danik. Danik then turns off the machine, the moon wakes up, and convergence is resumed. And you spend the last chapter trying to reach the machine to turn it back on. But this is so stupid when you consider that Isaac and Ellie share a last kiss before she leaves for Earth. And during this minute-long scene, none of these three go to the machine, which is meters in front of them, and turn the machine back on. Isaac, you wouldn't have to be sharing a last kiss with Ellie if you just walked 2 feet and turned the machine on. Carver is just standing there like a dipstick instead of turning the machine on, and Ellie walks past the machine on the way out. She's right next to it. Turn it back on. The game is really hoping that you don't notice how stupid all three of these characters are being. The only reason this is done is so Isaac and Carver can go out in a blaze of glory fighting a blood moon. Yes, the final boss of Dead Space 3 is a sentient moon. Isaac and Carver then beat the moon, they turn the machine back on, and die. Ellie confirms that the marker signal has faded, meaning that the mission was a success. She then heads back to Earth, and the game cuts to credits. After the credits, it's confirmed that Isaac survived, and that leads into the DLC. Dead Space 3's story as a whole is a complete mess. Whilst it does have some good moments, great performances, and interesting lore, the plot and characters is written so poorly that it's hard to enjoy any aspect of the game. And it's a shame considering how well put together Dead Space 2's story was. But as I just said, this isn't the actual end of Dead Space 3. Just a month after release, on the 12th of March, Dead Space 3 Awakened released, which continues the story from the ending. Okay, first of all, it's stupid that the actual ending to the game is locked behind a paywall, and second off, this was the last piece of Dead Space content ever produced until the 2023 remake. The DLC is also only an hour long, yet it still costs $10. You could buy Max Payne 1 and 2 both for that money. Since the DLC is so short, let's get through it quickly. Somehow Isaac and Carver survived.
Are we dead? That doesn't make any sense! Isaac, you activated the codex. The moon fell. We fell.
What about the alien machine? It froze the planet. It pulled the moon out of the sky. We don't know what that technology can do.
So that's it? We were saved by fucking aliens?
I quit trying to make sense of it all back on the Ishimura.
Come on, this can't be real. What are we supposed to do now?
Before the moon died, it called out to other brethren moons in the galaxy to warn them of its demise. Isaac and Carver then look for a way back to Earth, which mostly consists of them just going for reused areas from the main game. Both experience hallucinations and eventually come into contact with a cult worshipping the moons. Isaac says that they shouldn't return to Earth because the moons will then follow them, and Carver rejects that. Eventually this causes both to fight hallucinations of the other character, and this is pretty cool, but I am disappointed that it will only use the default armor of the other player instead of the actual armor the other player is wearing. They defeat the cult, fix the ship, and head back to Earth, only to discover that the Brethren moons have already arrived, and the game ends on a cliffhanger. I do appreciate the DLC's return to horror and its heavier focus on the psychological aspects of Dead Space, but it's short, it reuses areas and enemies from the main game, and it gives a worse ending than the main game, even if it is the most Dead Space part of Dead Space 3. Now, before Visceral Games shut down in 2017, they wanted to develop a Dead Space 4 with Ellie as the protagonist. The game would also expand on the crafting system of 3 and also feature full explorable ships in a non-linear style of design. But of course it was cancelled, and Dead Space wouldn't be heard from again until 2021 when the remake was announced. Whilst I love the remake and I'm happy it brought Dead Space back from the grave, I really hope we get a Dead Space 4, because for the past 10 years, and even to this day, this is the ending of the franchise.
What the fuck? The shit? Fuck off!
Yeah, that's the end.
That's the end of Dead Space.
Yeah, that's how Dead Space.
Oh, suck my cocky, eh?
What a way to go. In conclusion, Dead Space 3 is such a disappointing and at times sad game to play. It's the conclusion to a beloved trilogy of games, yet it does every aspect worse, and doesn't even manage to introduce new ideas of its own without failure. But the worst part about all of this is Visceral themselves. They didn't even get to make the game they wanted. All of their interesting ideas were thrown out in favor of something more marketable, ironically leading to a dead franchise. The men and women at this company worked for years to deliver a compromised version of their original vision, only to then be used for a Battlefield spin-off and closed down. So as much as I may criticize this game, I can't help but sympathize with everyone who worked on it. It clearly took a lot of blood, sweat and tears to make, and I can't even blame them for the game turning out this way. Electronic Arts are solely responsible for Dead Space 3 being the game that it is. Visceral were just the unfortunate souls who had to make it. Let this serve as an example of what happens when studios interfere with projects too much. Video games have always been a business through and through, but in the past decades so much emphasis has been put on monetary systems that it is having an actual effect on the development and quality of the finished product. Games are expensive and need to make money, I get that, but in today's climate, big games such as Elden Ring can release as a finished product with no monetized systems and still make a lot of profit in return purely because of the title's critical acclaim and its status among gamers. I really hope more studios learn that lesson, because if they don't, we'll get another Dead Space 3.